Hello everybody, and welcome to this latest video discussion in the Tech Partner Programme here at RICS. My name is Andrew Knight and I sit within the Regulatory Standards and Thought Leadership part of the organisation. I've been with the organisation for over 11 years now, and my role is to look at the effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with 110,000 members working worldwide, right across the property cycle, all the way through land, planning, development, construction, brokerage, valuation, property management, building operations and end of life, and across a wide range of asset types, rural land itself, commercial, office, residential, logistics, infrastructure. Obviously, the effect of data and tech is very profound and very positive for our sector. So I'm really glad today to have Jamie from View City join me. So Jamie, do join me on the discussion.
Morning, Andrew.
Morning, Jamie. Welcome to the call. And before we get into the kind of technology side, it's always nice to perhaps have a bit of a human element. So it'd be great to have a bit of backstory on your route to this particular firm, and indeed a bit of an origin story for View City itself.
Certainly, yeah. Me first. So I'm a mechanical engineer. I guess our institute is 2 or 3 stories down, I think, from Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So I haven't had to travel too far up the road to be now part of a new industry. So I was in manufacturing for many years, then moved into consulting, trying to combine my love with computers with love for manufacturing. Then my wife said, no longer should we live in Milton Keynes, come to London. So hence me being a consultant, and joined a wonderful company that was doing consulting services, implementing procurement systems. So I am the one that you need to blame for all of the hellish procurement processes that are now in large organisations. And then just thought, I want to do the full startup from almost the word go. And the View City opportunity came up working for 2 lovely founders, and I jumped at the chance. So I've been now with View City for coming up for 5 years. I can't believe how quickly time has flown. And I guess the origins of View City, as I said, is 2 lovely founders who, one from a sort of digital design agency, one from a daylight, sunlight, rights of light consultancy. One had wonderfully accurate digital models. One was very well versed with sort of real-time game engine technology, and the 2 of them sort of came together and said, I wonder whether or not we could do large-scale real-time viewing and understanding of the built environment. And off they went. We then got some funding from Savills, and subsequently got some more funding from another company, Ramboll. But that's allowed us really now to create 19 UK cities, all accurate to within 15 centimetres. So unlike sort of Google Earth, this is all about accuracy, not about wonderful looking things. So for us, we feel it is the primary platform really for local authorities, change proposers, change makers and stakeholders to really understand the story of change and what's being proposed.
Indeed. Now, I suppose in some way, the kind of planning process is perhaps a great example of the challenge that I think the whole built and natural environment faces around standardizing processes, around getting structured data available, about actually taking advantage of technology for processes that perhaps historically, and perhaps it's a bit unfair to say to the sector, but are still very much paper driven in the sense there's documents, there's data in silos, there's a lack of standardization. So I suppose my first question is really, given the planning process is, and perhaps this is a bit rude, it feels a bit Byzantine in terms of the complexity of it, and given the number of stakeholders that need to be involved as well, I'm thinking particularly about the kind of public stakeholders who should be part of it, it is very hard to navigate at the moment. There presumably is a case for standardizing the system, but what's your perspective on the use of technology, and dare I say it, a quite prescriptive, almost top-down drive to standardize what is, as I say, a very complex and Byzantine process?
So I guess I'll start by saying there is definitely the will. Speaking to all of our customers, whether or not they're in public or private sector, particularly the public sector, and given, I suspect there aren't enough people to do the job in the first place. So actually just doing their day job is challenging enough, let alone thinking about how we could potentially make the whole process more efficient. But the will is definitely there. So the challenge I think we've got is that the will sits at the sort of local level rather than raising it all up to the highest possible level. I think you can only truly get sort of proper standardisation if it's done across the board and driven across the board. But the will is definitely there, and we've got lots of local authorities that are talking to us at the moment about, how can they standardise their data? How can they publish their data? How can they make their data more easily understandable and digestible to, as you rightly say, the majority of the stakeholders who are you and me, worried about next door and what's being given for granted for planning. So the will is definitely there, but I think it has to be driven from the highest possible level. And I guess my joy and glee was all around, the levelling up and regeneration bill. All of these kind of things are starting to sort of hint at the fact that there's a will there at the highest level. I guess my concern is, will that still be around when we have a new prime minister? But or will it be changed again? And I guess that's my concern, rather than just let's just get on and do it, please.
Indeed, and I suppose that the opportunity is there. I'm sure you've read the bill, and it does specifically talk about almost a mandation of approved planning software. But arguably, that's quite a perhaps deliberately vague statement about what does that actually mean. I mean, what do you think is required from that in an ideal case? If you do get that kind of mandate, that top-down drive, how granular do you think that needs to be in terms of defining standards for exchanging data, for document formats, for almost something as simple as agreeing what we call data items, agreeing that we call the same things the same names, as it were?
Yes. I don't really know where to start there. I think if you sort of split it down into, I guess we've got the technology that sits behind tools, i.e. what you just talked about, the standardization of data, where's that data going to be stored, what's its naming conventions, all that kind of stuff. I think that has to be mandated, it has to be driven, and it has to be standardized. I think then there is the use of that data in interpreting that data and making it easily digestible for all of us. That's where I've always balked at the idea of mandating absolutely the technology that's available. So for me, if you can get the data and the things that sit behind sorted, then I think the right solutions to visualize and understand and interpret and communicate that data need not be mandated, although wouldn't it be lovely if it was View City? But I'm not pushing the platform. But I genuinely mean that. I mean, the more data we standardize, the more data there's going to be, and data in its sort of raw format is not particularly easily digestible or understandable. So, I think the tools that can interpret that data and visualize and make and communicate that data are what's going to be key. And as I said, I feel it's our job to make our platform the best it is, rather than necessarily mandating the use of specific technology to communicate that data.
Indeed. So I guess the key there is what's important is, excuse me, is a degree of mandation about that kind of underlying data architecture. But what we don't want is that stifling of innovation and sort of, development of how you visualize that, how you present that, because, arguably what you don't want is that sort of, stifling the ability to think, how can we present that data? How can we do better ways of actually communicating it? But if that underlying data is standardized, it really allows people like yourselves to innovate on top of that. And I think it would be a shame, as you say, if innovation was stifled by having a standard way of communicating data, when the important thing is that standardization of naming conventions and to use the phrase, the interoperability to make sure you can actually get data. And I suppose another important piece is this: so much of this data is held within government, either local or central government. Is that interconnectivity, that ability to join data sets together, really, isn't it?
Oh, completely. And again, there's two ways of doing that. You can have technology that itself combines, interprets, and presents, or you can have that sort of interpreted data also becoming part of the standard sort of lake of data that's available. I mean, the one that I guess the success story that's held up most is sort of something like City Mapper, isn't it? Which is, the data was so good, the quality of the data was good, it was accessible, it was machine readable. But actually, going back to your point, it was the innovation and the bright minds that said, well, how can we use this data for the benefit of everyone? So, that combination of of open source data and amazing innovation delivers things like Citymapper, which
Exactly.
I use on a daily basis to know whether or not I should wait for the bus or not.
And I guess, it always is such a political hot potato, to use the vernacular, the whole kind of planning process, because clearly, the end game for the Levelling Up bill is to increase availability of housing and other forms of accommodation and building. So, how do you think a more digitized planning process will help that? Because there's obviously we talked about, the fact that so many of the stakeholders of the public are always worried about what's being developed next door. How do you think that, better tools and standardization would actually help that kind of engagement piece? Because you ultimately want to make sure that communities are happy with development. Otherwise, we're never going to get increased development if we continually have communities who don't feel that they've been engaged with, being consulted, and indeed happy and understand what these future developments will look like.
So I wish I knew who I was quoting when I say this, but it was a wise man that said to me once that people are very happy to accept a decision that is whose outcome is not necessarily in their own benefit if they feel like the decision has been made through a fair process. And I think there is no doubt about it that even I wish I could say that I have none of this sort of not in my backyard thing, but you inherently do, you always do, but you also have this sort of other side, which is, but we know we've got to deliver more housing, we know we've got to have better sort of space around us, but I think a lot of people feel that the process itself hasn't been fair. So for me, that primarily that's about the sort of tools for engagement and the tools for communicating the very data that we've been talking about, to drive a process that ultimately people feel at least is a fair process, even if the outcome necessarily isn't perhaps what that individual wanted. So I think a lot's to do with the whole process. But within that whole process, one would hope that we can deliver significant more efficiency, and move out of the grey area, which I think is so prominent at the moment within the policies that we've got. There is a lot of grey, and I think the more we can make those black and white, then again I think the more people go, well, it's within the policy, therefore it's fair, which comes then back to even earlier than that, which is how do you create the policies that are fair in the process, and what's that fair process? But I'm living in a utopian world here, but I do think coming out of the coming out of the grey and becoming more black and white, and for that black and white to be much more understandable, I think is a really important thing. And again, one would hope that would drive so much more efficiency, because it's less time interpreting the various policies that are there.
As you say, and certainly speaking from personal experience of some planning I tried to get, which I did get eventually, it was that kind of ambiguity and greyness about actually, even though one could access documents on my local borough's website, one was left really not understanding whether I would be successful or not, because there was this ambiguity, almost deliberate ambiguity, of what would be allowed and what, quote, guidelines existed in a certain borough. So as you say, although life often unfortunately isn't black and white, you do want to err more in that direction about clarity. And I think, as you say, almost there's that, to use the jargon, that there's that sense of agency. Does the community felt they have and did have sufficient control within reason and agency and ability to influence, as you say, a decision which does affect them? So
yeah, I mean, we had a really interesting story actually. We were trying to expose, I won't mention which local authority it was, but we were trying to expose some of their planning submissions onto a portal, but make everything accessible. And there was some sort of rendered visualizations of the particular PROS policy that was buried in a PDF, that was buried in a website, that was buried, what have you. And there was almost question marks as to whether or not, should we be showing these? Do we have a right to show these? And it's like, well, they're already in the public domain. You just can't get to them, but they are already in the public domain. So of course you should be showing them. And it's about getting to that data. It wasn't that many years ago that someone claimed that they were completely digital in their information because they'd moved everything onto PDF. And to me, that's not digital. It's not accessible, and so all of that kind of stuff just needs to be looked at. But it's a big job, I get that. But
It is, yeah.
there's lots of people out there that want to help.
No, I mean, that does remind me of another local story where I managed to eventually find the Article 4 direction that affected my conservation area, and it was a PDF of a 1990s era typewritten document which somebody had manually, with a biro, written the house numbers that were affected by the direction. And I suppose that's an extreme example, but as you say, it's digital, but it's not really digital. And it felt like the scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, trying to find this sort of box on this digital estate that had that document in. So
you're right, and you can't help but picture that there's another side to that, another group of people going, I hope Andrew doesn't find this document.
Just hid it sufficiently well. And we mentioned the phrase open source already, and I suppose once again taking planning almost as a kind of a proxy for the broader challenges across the built environment. And I'm thinking about things like conveyancing and valuation. So often our challenge is data that's siloed, that's deemed to be, as you just discussed, is it confidential? Is it public domain? Is it open source? And I guess from your point of view, the availability of data is critical because your platform is absorbing data to present these visualizations. And where are we on that journey to having, I suppose, the balance between having enough open source data, but also the governance piece of making sure that we do protect information, not only from a kind of very pedantic GDPR perspective, but just making sure that that balance is achieved between access to data at scale, but still protecting the stakeholders?
Yeah. I mean, it gets me onto one of my other sort of pet points, but I can't help but think that there's always so much data that can make your argument right. And if you look at, well, recently the 10-year anniversary of the Olympic Park, and one complete half saying what a successful initiative that was and what an amazing legacy that has created, and using all sorts of data to prove that. And then you've got another half saying what a disaster it was, and it's cost us a fortune, it hasn't delivered on any of its promises. And it's almost like you have to agree what those criteria are in a measurable way right at the start of any change, and then go back and actually measure it against those statistics, so that you sort of, again, remove. There's so much social media at the moment with so many opinions, and they're all very compelling, and they can tell completely the opposite stories. And so the abundance of data is bound to create that. So do you say this is the right data and this is everything else? Again, Andrew, I'm not sure I completely know the answer, as you can probably tell from the fact that I'm almost trying to get out of answering that. But I think there should be. I think the more we can control that whole process of standardizing data, the more hopefully we can say, and this is the data that sits under that initiative. And therefore, this is the data that is going to allow us to report on everything that we measure success or failure in a change in a city, for example. And everything else is not noise, but it's not the official data. And I don't know how to do that, Andrew. I'd love to be part of it. It's a wicked problem, I would argue.
Yeah. And I suppose if we almost go back to that conversation we were having about that sort of need to mandate the kind of granular data standard type of thing, but not stifle innovation. I suppose another thing that's always easy to forget in that discussion is that almost equally, and perhaps more important than the kind of bits and bytes of what do we call things and how do we get data to flow around, it is that sort of top-down governance piece of making sure that all the actors, all the participants understand the controls around who should be able to see that data. And when you have data at scale, there are responsibilities there. So I guess that's another piece that we would hopefully look at a top-down governmental approach to give us that guidance on governance, because otherwise there is a danger that people will feel that information is almost too available.
Yes, okay, completely. And again, too much data is just noise in my mind. It's not information, it's just data. And for me, it goes back to the 2 points. We've got the silos or the new data source that's all wonderful, but it's actually how do you then understand that, interpret it, communicate it, etc. So,
well, I suppose it's back to the basics of signal to noise ratio, isn't it? And turning data into information, which is, I guess, a great link for you to perhaps show us actually how the platform View City actually does that, because you're presumably trying to distill a lot of information into something that's actually human readable. We've talked a lot about making data flow around in a machine readable form, but ultimately human beings need to see this data in a way that makes sense to them quickly, doesn't it?
Exactly. So there's a couple of things I just wanted to put up on the screen,
Yeah.
which I think, in my mind, are hopefully demonstrating the power of our platform in interpreting data, but actually are also a big nod to the GLA, actually, in this particular case, or what was even before the GLA, the GLC, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Which was just how much sort of digital policy there already was or is, that actually I think with the right tools to visualize it, and I can't even find my mouse now, here we go. So this is St Paul's Heights. So it is a grid, and this goes back, I should know, many years, long before, the City of London Corporation, long time
Well, it does.
ago.
So I live in Richmond, and there's a view from King Henry's Mound in Richmond Park where you must be able to see St Paul's, which I think is hundreds of years old.
Exactly, and actually, Andrew, that's the other one I wanted to show you, almost as if I knew that you lived in Richmond. But what's lovely about this is it's so black and white. This is saying, you can't build stuff that is higher than this. Now, obviously, there's some sort of historic bits in here that have popped up, but a great example. Let me just show you. So if I just zoom in on this area here, and I can't remember which building this is now, but how they wonderfully interpreted St Paul's Grid Heights. So actually, during the bit where there is policy, we can't build above it. But where we're outside of the heights, we can go a little bit higher. And to me, that's so black and white and so easy to understand and so easy to communicate as to why the design of the building is as it is and why it fits within policy, which I just think is just so simple. And yet, if you were to read that in a paper document, it would be really unclear, particularly if it was literally described in words rather than even a picture. We like to argue that a picture says 1,000 words, but surely a 3D picture therefore is a picture squared. So it's got to be at least 1 million words, I would argue, that we can show. So that was the first one. The second one, here you are, Andrew. But this is indeed King Henry VIII's mound, I think it is, from Richmond Park. So again, this is policy which says nothing in this red band here that's stretching across London all the way to Richmond can be in the way of the two towers and St Paul's and the Dome. Anything in the orange, come and talk to us about it. And anything behind could potentially affect the facade of St Paul's Dome and therefore needs consideration. Now, again, what I love about this is it's so black and white, but again, in terms of how that's described in paper, it's a very difficult thing to actually put into use. But you stick it into a 3D digital platform, you can fly around all of this, you can test everything, and you can just instantly know whether or not your proposed change is acceptable or not. Now, whether or not we agree or don't agree with those policies, they're enshrined in many years' worth of constraint and on the whole, are well adhered to. And we're speaking to a number of other local authorities, both in London at a local level, to start coming up with their own protected views. So again, it takes the black and white, the grey out of it and makes it much more black and white. We're also speaking to the likes of Oxford City Council to do the same. So for me, these are wonderful ways where you can just make things much more efficient, much more transparent, and be able to communicate why it is that you're proposing the change that you are. And many people sort of bash developers for the fact that they're making loads of money and they're doing X, Y, and Z. Well, actually, there's an awful lot of constraints that they work within to deliver what they're trying to deliver and to deliver the yield that they're trying to make. So actually, being able to communicate that in the thought process, I think, is really important. So I wasn't going to bore you with the whole of View City, but I just think these are sort of two powerful ways to sort of visualize policy in this particular case.
Exactly, and given how important these various sources of open source data are for you, I mean, what next steps would you like the government and the marketplace to take to enable you to do even more?
So many authorities have protected views, but they're not digitized. If they're digitized, we can visualize them. So that is, for us, a nice, easy step. And as I said, I would hope that for all the different stakeholders, for the local authorities, it drives efficiency, removes the grey. For all of the private sector that are proposing change, again, it drives efficiency. I mean, our platform, I would love to see, I'd love to see both parties coming together at a much earlier stage and actually discuss around View City what might be feasible and what might not be feasible, rather than sort of taking schemes to a point before submission. So I'd love to see more sort of public and private working together around some of these policies. But also, obviously, I'd love to see all of these policies in an easily digestible way, ideally through View City, that we can communicate with every stakeholder that is concerned about their local area.
And given, I guess, the sort of the obvious interplay between central government, local government, and other agencies, and we've discussed this sort of sense of a degree of mandation from the top down. What would you like to see the government do? What would be the balance between the level of mandation and indeed, perhaps to be blunt, how they could support local authorities? Because obviously local authorities have a very stretched resource, as we alluded to earlier. There aren't enough planners. So, what do you think central government could and should be doing to help local authorities, and also at that top level, drive change, but as we discussed, not stifle the innovation?
Yeah. So from central government, I think for me it has to be the place where you drive standardisation of data and standardisation of the ways to potentially visualise or the things that should be within policy, rather than having. I'm not saying we don't have local policy. I think we absolutely should, but it should all be presented in the same way. There should be the similar types of things. We have protected views. We have, whatever those local policies are.
Yeah.
The central government are doing quite a bit actually. There is a prop tech engagement fund that's been driven at the moment. I'd like to see them carrying that on, which is grants for authorities to use technology to help engage the public in everything that they're doing around planning and development. I'd love to see that carrying on, because I think that level of supporting the local authorities with funds, but for the local authorities to then choose which are the technologies that they like. The other thing that I think central government are doing, and I'd like to see them do more, is to maybe coordinate the showcasing of amazing technology that may well be the tools that are the best to be used in the local authority. So, lots of sort of showcasing events of saying, you've got this fund now, how best to spend it, but allowing the local authority to make the final decision, because the last thing I want is for the central government to mandate the use of View City within local government. Local government doesn't buy into that, and it sits on the shelf gathering dust. That's completely useless.
Indeed. No, as I think we discussed earlier on, it's that balance, isn't it? Because the best innovation will take place in firms like yourselves, and there is that balance between mandating a certain kind of standardization under the bonnet almost, but allowing people to flourish on top of that in terms of how they actually implement that. So, well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I know one that will continue, and I look forward to catching up again, Jamie. But for today, thanks ever so much for your time, and I say look forward to catching up again.
Andrew, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for allowing me to be here.